All right, we'll do a video now on our TCM integration of anxiety and insomnia. And there's a fair bit to say here. So this is definitely not going to be a comprehensive lecture, but there's a fair bit to say here. And again, as I like to say, why do we do this? We do this because I think if you've got these skills, you may as well use them, and it can be a really useful way of helping us. So far we've mostly been saying anxiety, insomnia, but we know there are lots of different patterns under each of those. And some of what we can do in looking at it from a TCM perspective, at least in terms of assessment, is to help differentiate, and that of course helps lead us into treatment. So let's take a look at it. So anxiety and insomnia are primarily viewed as manifestations of the heart, and that's quite useful to remember, in that these are conditions of the heart, but the initial organs out of balance almost always are others. So the heart sometimes, yes, but rarely is the first organ injured. The heart's the most protected of the organs, and almost always what we'll find is what's agitating the heart or worrying the heart or failing to supply the heart is going to originate in another organ. Almost always those organs are going to be the spleen, the liver, and the kidneys. Could it be the lungs? Sure, we don't see it that often as a pattern. Mostly what we see is something originating in one of these other organs. Symptoms of anxiety and insomnia derive from four, now there are others, but I'm going to say mostly, four basic patterns in TCM. Blood deficiency, yin deficiency. This one's a really important one. Stagnant liver chi producing heat and wind, and full heat. So we've got these main patterns. Oops, I erased. Just spent all the time putting boxes around them. We've got these four main patterns. Now, I think I wrote it. Yeah, I did write it in here. Full heat is the least common. And although certainly it causes not so much anxiety, but more insomnia, that's usually that. I think I've got it all in here. Yeah, so that's usually with a significant underlying mental health condition, toxic heat, substances, acute trauma, things like that. So you're not going to treat very much of that. You might, sure, depending on what you get into. Mostly, though, it's these other three, and even of these three, it's really two of these that we see most often. This is where we break it down into a deficiency pattern of blood deficiency, which we see all the time. We mentioned this in the first video, which was to say, if someone doesn't have the resources to support their resiliency, then they easily become overwhelmed. It's also to say, as simple as you've got to have enough iron and protein and fat and all your macronutrients in order to have your body do the things that it needs to do. Oxygenation of blood is really key here. People can't breathe well, or sometimes, so maybe that's where I guess maybe the lung organ, but oxygenation of blood plays a major role. I've got at least one patient I can think of where an inability to breathe well due to congestion, so unrelated, but that creates anxiety. Now, all of us know if you can't breathe, we become very anxious very quickly, so that does play a role. It's not that common of a pattern though, but blood deficiency is one of the most common, and what's great about it is one of the easiest ones to treat because all you have to do is build blood and chi. Chi deficiency gives us a lighter pattern of anxiety and insomnia, but not insignificant. So that's our deficiency pattern. The other one that we see, now obviously yin deficiency is a deficiency pattern, and this one's really simple. This gives us empty heat, harassing, agitating, whatever you want to say, harassing the heart. And we see this, usually that's going to be kidney or liver. We see that, easy example of that is a menopausal woman with a hot flash. That's empty heat rising up. It's going to cause that agitation, sometimes anxiety, often insomnia. But we can see that we do see that in younger people as well. Some practitioners say you never see yin deficiency in young people. There's some truth to that, but I think you can. I mean, we can see we have it, especially in anxiety, insomnia cases. We run patients through all the symptoms, like, well, you're only 20, let's make it 32, but you've got the criteria, right down to night sweats. So we can see those in younger people, though. It's kind of like you have to earn a yin deficiency, and if you have, it's going to be a long walk back. It's not an impossible walk back, but if you're a younger person with yin deficiency, you've failed to catch, again, no judgment, but you've failed to catch some warning signs along the way, and there is going to be some challenge in going back the distance to get to where you want to get. So that's the inefficiency. Now, this is the one I see the most. Alongside blood deficiency, stagnant liver qi producing heat and wind as our pattern. And this is something that, we talk about a fair bit, but stagnation, and this is really common in younger people. Most of the presentations that we see are related to stagnant liver qi creating heat. It's very common. Most might be stretched, but a lot in a younger person, even when because we talk about all the time spleen qi deficiency. But often, it's not so much that the spleen itself is qi deficient. Obviously, it can be. It's more that the liver and frustration and the stagnation of qi, things not moving, is what's injuring the spleen, is what's damaging the spleen. It's damaging digestion. It's creating all kinds of other problems as well. So stagnant liver qi, as it stagnates, it heats up and it starts to create heat. And when we have heat, we start to have wind as well. Anxiety, especially panic attacks, although panic attacks are usually more associated with the kidneys, are conditions of wind. They come on very suddenly and they're very intense. So we know we've got wind and we know we've got heat. And almost always in panic attacks, especially, we almost have to have an underlying deficiency. And that's a big part why they're related to the kidneys. But an ongoing heat, especially when we talk about insomnia, a little more so than anxiety, is what creates that restlessness. And so when we talk about treatment, we don't just use nervines and sedatives. If we see, which it's usually not too hard to figure out, okay, we've got stagnant heat in the liver. That's creating anxiety, that's creating tension, frustration. Often we'll see headaches, we'll see some other uprising signs, and we will almost certainly see something in the digestion as well, and probably something in the menses if it's a woman. But when we see that stagnant liver heat, we don't say anxiety, we say, oh, stagnant liver heat. Let's clear that, and then we see that restless agitation pattern start to go down. So I wanted to make sure we talked about that in there because that can certainly cause it. Now, can we have stagnant liver heat and a blood deficiency and maybe at least a kidney deficiency? Maybe not a kidney yin deficiency, but at least a kidney qi deficiency. Sure, we can have all those things at the same time, and we often do. If we think about the reality of a common presentation that we see, let's make it a 32-year-old. That's not a random choice. That's about the time when Jing is not so abundant that it can just buffer everything. 28 to 32 is where I see this a lot. Where Jing and that ample blossoming Jing isn't there to just help you give the extra to buffer everything anymore. And some of that's wearing out. And so what we see kidneys in decline, kidney function in decline. We can also use the word adrenals there. So someone's kidneys are tired. Their source qi is depleted. But they're also living a life and they're trying to work and manage relationships and maybe manage a family, and they're overwhelmed, and we talked about that. So they're moving into further kidney adrenal deficiency, but they're also probably getting frustrated. They're also probably not able to do satisfactorily all the things that they want to do, and maybe they're thwarted in certain areas of their lives. And it's very common to see that liver qi, maybe even just like if they have to commute every day, that's going to stagnate and frustrate the liver qi. So we can have that, and then consequently we can also have, if you've got stress and you've got anxiety and you've got declining adrenal function, and maybe you're not eating as well as you should or exercising quite as well as you should, that's going to give you some blood deficiency as well. So it's very common to have those patterns come together, and because all of them can be contributors to anxiety, is it coincidence that we see anxiety as something so commonly pervasive? No, it's almost certainly not. So that's kind of taking a look at that. But there's some differentiations if we want to make some of those. The anxiety and insomnia of blood deficiency see exactly what we expect. Poor memory, poor concentration, easily startled or disturbed, that's light sleep in the evening, general feeling of unrootedness. Primary causes, spleen failing to build blood, and liver failing to house the blood because it doesn't have, and the hun, because it doesn't have the blood, the resources to properly build that house. Pretty easy to treat. If it's just blood deficiency, especially if someone has some kind of dietary restriction, that's often very easy to treat because you just build that back up. Now, you might have to deal with other things that are obstacles to that, but that's often the clearest path to improvement and often even resolution. Yin deficiency and stagnant liver heat create a heat that harasses the heart. They're not the same, but that's the outcome. We get transient or ongoing heart yin deficiency as a progression. Don't think of that as the main diagnosis, but it certainly can turn up as a progression. The anxiety associated with general yin deficiency patterns and liver heat harassing patterns is going to be more restless, anxious, feelings of uprising heat, can't quite sit still. The insomnia that we see here is almost always difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep, versus blood deficiency. Usually, because they're blood and qi deficient, they actually collapse. If you ask them, do you have trouble falling asleep? They say, I have trouble staying awake. They fall asleep very easily, but then they sleep very lightly, so they're often woken up. Unlike stagnant heat in the liver and yin deficiency, often they have a hard time falling asleep because there's a restless agitation there, and they have a hard time staying asleep because their mind, etc., hun, is waking them up, trying to help them out to get them to do and take care of whatever they need to take care of. Yeah, same idea. If you do have more of that stagnant pattern, expect to see, especially in the daily life, probably more of an irritability pattern than less associated anxiety. I would say that stagnant liver heat certainly can create anxiety, but it's more linked to an insomnia pattern. Here we do have where the lung comes in. So I mentioned up here spleen, liver, and kidneys. There are some lung patterns. Injury of the lung through grief and loneliness will also cause wakings. We don't quite call that insomnia, but we did mention that in the last one. Will cause waking. Usually, though, in these cases, people can sleep before and after these hours. It's really quite fascinating. They'll say, I wake up very regularly, right around 4. And then I'm up for an hour, usually 2 to 5. Sometimes they wake a little bit earlier, but usually they're up for some amount of time between 3 and 5. And then they say around 5, maybe it's 6, depending, I can get back to sleep, and then I sleep for a couple more hours, but I don't feel refreshed when I wake. It's a very, very common pattern. So that's a very brief overview. I'll see if I can actually post a couple other materials on TCM, anxiety, and insomnia, but a brief overview, and hopefully that helps guide how you start to look at it in terms of treatment, which is what we're going to get into in our next couple videos.